Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Introduction to Personalized Learning, Part 1. I will be your host, Maddie Shepard. I am a deeper learning resource teacher. Technically, I'm assigned to Zone 2 schools, which are elementary schools. So if you're in Zone 2, I'm your contact. And if not to worry, you can reach out to myself or any one of my teammates for any and all things deeper learning. And again, today our discussion is personalized learning. So let's jump in. We'll be focusing on two things today. First, the why. Why are we having this conversation? Where have we been in education? And what are some recent-ish impetuses to push us in this direction? And then secondly, what is personalized learning? What is it simply boiled down? What is it not, just to dispel misconceptions? And then taking a look at a framework to help us look at some of the primary components of what personalized learning is and a preview into what it could look like in your own classroom. All right, so part one, why personalized learning? Well, we'll start with where we've been. Here you'll see Frederick Taylor, who is regarded as the father of scientific management. You might be saying, well, I haven't learned about him in college or any other professional learning environment. And that's because he's not really an educator. Frederick Taylor comes from the world of economics and studied, he went to school in Prussia, where he learned about how to standardize processes to make them more efficient. And so he brought this idea to the United States, had a lot of influence over the Industrial Revolution and the way that manufacturers worked during that time. And he is responsible for a large part of the way that the Industrial Revolution panned out in terms of factories in our country. But he had an idea. Standardization was working out so well in factories, and production was increased, profits were increased, that he thought, what if we apply this idea that became known as Taylorism or scientific management, came to schools? And so he met with education titans like Edward Thorndike, who you probably have heard of, and decided to apply the same concepts that he had in factories during the Industrial Revolution to schools. Things like sorting students into categories based on whether they were going to be workers or managers that would then grow up and fuel the work demand in factories during the Industrial Revolution and beyond. They standardized everything about education, standardizing curriculum, standardizing the experience, even replicated the schedule, which is why in a lot of schools we still have a bell schedule, because that's the way that factories worked as well. You'll see that Edward Thorndike is also wearing a sorting hat. In addition to a lot of the Taylorist principles that titans like him and Edward Thorndike brought into the education system, he also started to sort students based on a variety of assessments, hence where the first standardized assessments came from. So school became standardized and learners began to get sorted. Now what this meant is that learners were sorted, like I said, on a variety of assessments into two tracks, workers and managers. And that meant a different curriculum. Workers had one curriculum and managers had one curriculum. And that was inherently inequitable. So we saw this division and separation and sorting of learners across the country in all school settings, and each learner was getting a different experience and had different outcomes based on these assessments, which weren't always learner-centered or had equity in mind. But it also meant that we sorted curriculum too. So this is where the siloing of our school subjects came from as well. In order to continue to standardize, we not only had to standardize the way we sorted learners and place them in classes and place them with curriculum, we also needed to standardize the way that we thought about curriculum in order to be more socially efficient in education. And so math was its own silo, the arts were its own silo, social studies, ELA, science, every subject, and so on. And each of those silos was also given a time, usually an arbitrary amount of time. So math gets time, the arts get time, social studies gets time, 45 minutes here, 50 minutes there, depending on your schedule. And all of these subjects were siloed into their own areas. Again, all of this coming out of the Taylorist ideas that began in manufacturing to make manufacturing and then school eventually efficient, super efficient. Was it best for kids? Probably not. Was it best for efficiency and profit and for manufacturing during the Industrial Revolution? Yeah, but we're in a different economy now, and our schools are different now. So that's not the only place where we've been. So we're also going to talk about the impetus for this shift as well. So I'm going to tell you a little story from the book The End of Average by Todd Rose. If you find yourself looking for some good professional reading, this is an awesome option. It's not necessarily a book on education, but a lot of the principles blow up a lot of traditional thinking around education. So I would highly recommend. Blew my mind, gave me a lot of great ideas, and speaks a lot to educators and our education system. So in this book, we meet Norma. And in the 1950s and 60s, so you can kind of deduce from this picture here, there was a newspaper that put out a contest for women. And the contest was to see who, the American normal quintessential woman was, what she looked like, who she was. So what happened was that an average was made of all types of measurements of women. Wingspans and waist sizes and heights and all kinds of things were averaged together. And women were encouraged to send their measurements into the newspaper to see which one of them met the criteria to be Norma. And I think would eventually be named, the real Norma woman and have her picture in the newspaper and all that jazz. So women got really excited about this, and they did it. They took their measurements and sent them into the newspaper. And after more and more measurements were sent into the newspaper, a truth arose, which was that not a single woman's measurements matched the amalgam that was Norma. Not a single woman had measurements that matched the average of all of the measurements averaged together. So surprise, in the end, this idea that we'd had of the normal woman, or at least in terms of body type, wasn't real. In fact, there were lots of PE exercises and parts of curriculum that were developed off of this average that we then had to go back and revamp because we realized that these body types, there was no such thing as average. It wasn't real. Because we're all different. Bodies are different and learners are different. So the first truth, our first impetus for personalized learning is that there's no such thing as normal or standard when it comes to people. So why are we normalizing and standardizing education? Why are we constructing experiences based on the average? Why are we forming expectations based on the average? And why are we standardizing education? Well, there used to be a pretty good reason, but it's time to shift. So the second why is that our future looks different. When we were in a time when probably the largest overhaul of education was before, this current time period during the Industrial Revolution, our economy looked a lot different than it does now. So we're going to pause and watch a really short video on what the future of work looks like for us and our kids. That video is from a lot of people, but primarily Ted Dintersmith, author of What School Could Be, which is a great video and a great partner for JCPS Deeper Learning. But you probably saw a lot of stuff in that video that excites you as a consumer, but might scare you as an educator. We saw new industries, we saw age-old industries being changed by technology and automation, and we saw that things change really, really quickly. That piece at the end where we see a picture of a city street in 1900 and everyone has horses, and a mere 13 years later, everyone has cars. And that was when things moved slowly. So we can anticipate change very quickly. We can anticipate our economy changing quickly, and thusly the needs of our kids to thrive in that economy changing very quickly as well. There's some other stats that are pretty interesting too. So our kids, and even including generations that are already out in the job force, are statistically expected to change careers, not jobs, 3 times over their working lifetime, from beginning work in their late teens, early 20s, up until retirement. And what that means is, whereas we saw that people were able to stay within the same career and retire from that same career, that's not happening as often as much anymore. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But the big piece here is that kids will change careers, not jobs, over 3 times over their working lifetime, which means they will need a more diverse set of skills than they've ever needed before. We also know there are new industries that are popping up every day. And that's not just related to the STEM field. We see new hospitality industries, industries in the arts, like all kinds of things popping up every day. So it makes it impossible for us to predict what kids will need when they leave us. We're also seeing a more globalized world than ever before. Our relationships economically, socially, politically are more interconnected with other countries than they ever have been before. And then finally, probably the biggest thing we saw in that video was the rise of automation. Automation is changing a lot of industries and a lot of parts of our lives. And so looking at all of these things, it forces us to come to the conclusion that our kids' future is uncertain and it's subject to change very quickly. So we can't prepare kids for a single outcome anymore. We have to prepare them for several, all outcomes. So whereas education might have been able to get away with preparing learners for one career and doing its job, we wouldn't be satisfying our charge anymore, because that's not what our future calls for. Learning should be personal. because our futures are different and they change all the time. And if we need to arm learners with a variety of skills, standards, and competencies to thrive and adapt within this world, we can't standardize learning anymore. It has to be personalized. So what is personalized learning? Great question, glad you asked. Well, in a nutshell, it's learner-centered. It's an educational experience where the learner makes decisions, real decisions about their learning. I'm not talking about the red pencil or the blue pencil, or who their partner is on a project. Real decisions about how they access learning, how they engage with learning, and how they might demonstrate learning. It also means that learners have ownership because they make these decisions and have agency in making those decisions. They will have learnership over the experience. It's not just something that's the teachers to make decisions about anymore, but it has to be flexible. Our futures and our current realities change all the time, and education has to be just as agile. Learners have voice and choice in their experience. And again, that voice and choice in those decisions help build learner agency so that kids can really have ownership of this and be drivers of their own learning, and it's personal to them. Let's watch our second and I believe final video of the day. This is Sal Khan, the founder of Khan Academy, which just turned 10 years old last year. So that's crazy to think about. But he makes some really good points about why personalized learning, and that education, coincidentally, has been one of the last industries to consider this type of thinking and design for how we do things.
That was a pretty big deal. I don't know how much time y'all spend on YouTube. Most of the comments are not thank you. They're a little edgier than that. But then the comments got a little bit more intense. Student after student saying that they had grown up not liking math. It was getting difficult as they got into more advanced math topics. By the time they got to algebra, they had so many gaps in their knowledge that they just couldn't engage with it. And they thought that they didn't have the math gene. But when they were a little bit older, they took a little bit of agency and they decided to engage. They found resources like Khan Academy, and they were able to fill in those gaps and master those concepts, and that reinforced their mindset that it wasn't fixed, that they actually were capable of learning mathematics. And in a lot of ways, this is how you would master a lot of things in life. It's the way that you would learn a martial art. In a martial art, you would practice the white belt skills as long as necessary. And only when you've mastered it, you would move on to become a yellow belt. It's the way that you would learn a musical instrument. You practice the basic piece over and over again, and only when you've mastered it, you go on to the more advanced one. But what we point out, this is not the way that a traditional academic model is structured, the type of academic model that most of us grew up in. In a traditional academic model, we group students together, usually by age and around middle school age and perceived ability. And we shepherd them all together at the same pace. And what typically happens, let's say we're in a middle school pre-algebra class and the current unit is on exponents. The teacher will give a lecture on exponents, then we'll go home, do some homework. The next morning we'll review the homework, then we'll get another lecture, homework. That'll continue for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then we get a test. And on that test, maybe I get a 75%, maybe you get a 90%, maybe you get a 95%. And even though that test has identified gaps in our knowledge, I didn't know 25% of the material. Even the A student, what was the 5% they didn't know? Even though we've identified those gaps, the whole class will then move on to the next subject. Probably a more advanced subject that's going to build on those gaps. It might be logarithms or negative exponents. And that process continues. And you immediately start to realize how strange this is. I didn't know 25% of the more foundational thing, and now I'm being pushed to the more advanced thing. And this will continue for months, and it'll continue for years, all the way to at some point, I might be in an algebra class or trigonometry class, and I hit a wall. And it's not because algebra is fundamentally difficult or because the student isn't bright. It's because I'm seeing an equation and they're dealing with exponents, and that 30% that I didn't know is showing up. And then I start to disengage. And to appreciate how absurd that is, imagine if we did other things in our life that way. Say home building. So we bring in the contractor, say, told we have 2 weeks to build the foundation, do what you can. So they do what they can, Maybe it rains, maybe some of the supplies don't show up. And 2 weeks later, the inspector comes, looks around, says, okay, the concrete's still wet right over there. That part's not quite up to code. I'll give it an 80%. Say, great, that's a C, let's build the first floor. Same thing. We have 2 weeks, do what you can. Inspector shows up in 2 weeks, it's a 75%. Great, that's a D plus. Second floor, third floor, and all of a sudden while you're building the third floor, that whole structure collapses. And if your reaction to that is the reaction that you typically have in education, or that a lot of folks have in education, you might say, maybe we had a bad contractor, or maybe we needed better inspection or more frequent inspection. But what was really broken was the process. We were artificially constraining how long we had to do something, pretty much ensuring a variable outcome. And we took the trouble of inspecting and identifying those gaps, but then we built right on top of it. So the idea of mastery learning is to do the exact opposite. Instead of artificially constraining when and how long, fixing when and how long you work on something, pretty much ensuring that variable outcome, the A, B, C, D, F, do it the other way around. What's variable is when and how long a student actually has to work on something, and what's fixed is that they actually master the material. And it's important to realize that not only will this make the student learn their exponents better, but it'll reinforce the right mindset muscles. It makes them realize that if you got 20% wrong on something, it doesn't mean that you have a C branded in your DNA somehow. It means that you should just keep working on it. You should have grit. You should have perseverance. You should take agency over your learning. Now, a lot of skeptics might say, well, hey, this is all great. Philosophically, this whole idea of mastery-based learning and its connection to mindset, students taking agency over their learning, makes a lot of sense, but it seems impractical. To actually do it with students, it seems like every student would be on their own track. They would have to be personalized. You would have to have private tutors. You would have to work worksheets for every student. And there were experiments. These aren't new ideas. There were experiments in Winnetka, Illinois 100 years ago where they did mastery-based learning, and they saw great results, but they said it wouldn't scale because it was logistically difficult. And the teacher had to give different worksheets to every student, give on-demand assessments. But now today, it's no longer impractical. We have the tools to do it. Students need an explanation at their own time and pace. Well, there's on-demand video for that. They need practice. They need feedback. Well, there's adaptive exercises. It's readily available for students. And when that happens, all sorts of neat things happen. One, the students can actually master the concepts, but they're also building their growth mindset. They're building their grit, their perseverance. They're taking agency over their learning. And all sorts of beautiful things can start to happen in the actual classroom. Instead of it being focused on the lecture, students can interact with each other. They can get deeper mastery over the material. They can go into simulation, Socratic dialogue. And to appreciate what we're talking about and kind of the tragedy of lost potential here, I like to give a little bit of a thought experiment. If we were to go 400 years into the past, to Western Europe, which even then was one of the more literate parts of the planet, you would see that about 15% of the population knew how to read. And I suspect that if you ask someone who did know how to read, say a member of the clergy, what percentage of the population do you think is even capable of reading? And they might say, well, with a great education system, maybe 20 or 30%. But if you fast forward to today, we know that that prediction would have been wildly pessimistic, that it's pretty close to 100% of the population is capable of reading. But if I were to ask you a similar question, what percentage of the population do you think is capable of truly mastering calculus, or understanding organic chemistry, or being able to contribute to cancer research? A lot of y'all might say, well, with a great education system, maybe 20, 30%. But what if that estimate is just based on your own experience in a non-mastery framework, your own experience with yourself or observing your peers, where you're being pushed at this set pace through classes, accumulating all these gaps. Even when you got the A, that 95%, what was that 5% that you missed? And it keeps accumulating all the way that you get to a more advanced class, and all of a sudden you hit a wall and say, oh, I'm not meant to be a cancer researcher. I'm not meant to be a physicist. I'm not meant to be a mathematician. And I suspect that that actually is the case, but if you were allowed to be operating in a mastery framework, if you were allowed to really take agency over your learning, and when you get something wrong, embrace it, view that failure as a moment of learning, that number of the percent that could really master calculus or understand organic chemistry is actually a lot closer to 100%. And this isn't even just based on my observation.
We'll stop there.
At least based on my observation.
But You can view the rest of the video. There's a lot of knowledge dropped in that section that we listened to, and there's even more throughout the rest of the video. So a few things to touch on before we move on. The first thing that we saw Sal Khan talk about was this idea of gaps in knowledge. And if you're a teacher that's, taught for 6 weeks, you know that this is true. You know that we have artificial restraints like the ones that Sal mentioned, like time, that force this outcome, that force learners to have gaps because the outcome is variable and time is not. And those gaps start to show up and kids start to check out. We know statistically speaking, by high school, very few kids are still engaged. And a lot of that has to do with self-efficacy. If these gaps continue to build and compound and show up, learners become disengaged. We also know that education, for a variety of reasons, but largely because of the standardization practices that were put in place during the Industrial Revolution, that learners are expected to progress at an average pace, which we now know there is no such thing as average when it comes to learners or brains, and progress based on a fixed variable, which is time. What if learners could progress when they're competent, when and only when they're competent, where the time is variable, but the outcome is not? If the outcome is always competence, then time needs to be variable. So some big things here, and Sal Khan also mentioned agency. Kids have to have agency over their learning in order for these things to happen, in order to drive the decisions that go into learning experiences that do end up in learners having control over their pathway to reach competence. But just to be clear, Sal Khan does come from technology. He is the founder of Khan Academy. And the Deeper Learning team and I experience a lot of misconceptions around the relationship between personalized learning and technology. What we see here is a classroom from the Industrial Revolution where we've just placed laptops in it. It's still standardized, but now every kid has tech. And what I want to make really clear is that personalized learning is not dependent on technology. Technology does make it easier. As you heard, a lot of the technology that we have available to us today as educators allows us to have the tools we need to personalize learning. But in the end, they're just that, they're tools. They themselves are not personalized. You might hear of a program that's being sold to your school, that's being sold as personalized. Well, remember that in that scenario, the school is the consumer and the education technology company is trying to sell a product. And just because they say their product is personal doesn't mean it is. When we remove the person from the decision-making process and we put kids in front of a lot of adaptive technology, that's not personalized. It might be better than standardized, but it's not personalized. So just to be clear, putting a laptop in front of a learner is not personalized learning. We also experience a lot of teachers that hear our message and immediately think, whoa, well, this means I've got to have a lesson, a personalized lesson for every learner, for every day, for every subject, all the time. And that just isn't true. While personalized learning does mean restructuring the way that we use resources, the way that we craft experiences, and the way that we engage learners in this process, it doesn't mean making 25 lessons a period for every kid every day. That would be insane. There are some ways that we're going to look at how to begin personalizing, and they don't include any of that. So we'll move on to the next piece, which is a framework in which to think about personalized learning. What I'm going to introduce you to is something called the honeycomb model, because it looks like a honeycomb. And it's from one of our district partners, the Institute for Personalized Learning, out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. If you click on this picture here, it is a link, it's a button that'll take you to their website, and it'll take you to an interactive version of the honeycomb. Now, the reason that I click on this and show this to you is that this cooperative has come up with this framework to help us define personalized learning and the components that make it. But you'll notice that there are empty cells here. And that's because we're we're thinking about personalized learning differently all the time. Our idea of this isn't static, it's dynamic, it changes constantly. And so these cells are intentionally left open so that there's always room for revision of the honeycomb. Now, if you were to click on any one of these cells, you would be able to look at each one of these components up close. So let's go back to our slide deck and take a look at this model. So you'll see this model is composed of kind of 4 levels. In the middle, we have the blue cells, then we have the gold, the green, and finally on the outside, we have the purple. And we're gonna go through what each of those levels mean and how to leverage them in our learning designs. So first in the middle, we have what are called our core components. If we were to boil personalized learning down into its most basic forms, we have these 3 big ideas. We've got proficiency-based progress. We talked about that with Sal Khan. Kids progressing when they show proficiency or when they show competency, so that the pacing is variable rather than the outcome. The second piece is learner profiles. Learner profiles are in themselves like physical entities. They can be digital or they can be, in real life, but it's a way for us to capture data about a learner and share that with the learner. Ideally, the learner would have total control over their profile, whether it looks like a website or a slide deck or even just a binder. And learners update their data, they add assessments. But it's not just about academic data. Learner profiles can have information about a learner's personal strengths and preferences, their goals for learning, their pathways to learning. And this is a great central piece to bring into a coaching conversation when teachers are ready to bring learners into decision-making. We can use the learner profile to reflect on where we've been and use that information to help learners continue growing and making better decisions. And then finally, customized learning paths. So our pathways to learning, again, don't have to be standardized. There can be multiple pathways that learners can access new information, engage with that new information, and demonstrate learning with that information. So customizing the pathway to engagement and to mastery is another core component of personalized learning. We see a lot of people start in one of these areas and really focus their lesson design on making a shift related to one of these cells. Next, if we zoom out a little bit, we've got our teaching and learning components. Now, I'm not going to go through these with the same amount of depth as I did with the core components, and because there's many more of them on the website. But our teaching and learning components, this is the level of the honeycomb that has to do with our learning design. So we've got things like personal learning goals, where kids should be setting goals for academics, behavior, aspirational, all kinds of stuff. Learner choice and feedback. What I want to point out about feedback is that there's a lot of pieces to this honeycomb that aren't old or new, that are just true. Feedback is necessary for learners to communicate with teachers, but also to know where they are on mastery of a skill. We give feedback in the form of grades, but there's lots of ways to give feedback. And so again, there's other cells in this level, but these are just some examples. And again, these are the things that influence teaching and learning, our learning designs, stuff that goes on in the classroom or in our plans. I believe these big cells are clickable, by the way. So if you click on one of these larger cells, it'll take you to that level of the honeycomb, so you can more intimately engage with each one of the cell components. The third level is all about roles and relationships. When we start to shift the way that we make our learning designs, when we start to shift the way that we engage learners in making decisions, roles and relationships within a classroom start to shift as well. And so this third level, this green level, is all about those shifts that occur with the roles and relationships, especially the power relationships between learners and teachers. We see that when learners get agency over learning and they can make decisions over their learning pathways, over their learning goals, that they become co-designers of learning. We start to see this leveling of the power structure. Learners also see themselves and each other as resources because they have a say in their learning pathways. And then again, one of those pieces is not old or new, it's just true, is community connections. They always say it takes a village to raise a child, and we know that education is no different. And so this cell is all about engaging that village, bringing the village in, not just to see the work of learners, to create awareness, which is, you know, a pretty big piece, but engaging industry experts in projects. You know, as teachers, we are masters of many trades and skills, but jacks of all trades, but masters of none. There we go. And so that's to say that while we might be able to provide a general swath of information for learners, there are industry experts out there that we can engage in the community to help learners get even more deeply educated and experience the content more deeply, depending on what they're interested in. This is also a great way to make connections, personal connections, form relationships, and really get the community involved in what schools are doing and where we're headed. So community connections is a big piece of roles and relationships. But again, I would just remind you that there are other pieces in this, this green ring here. And finally, we have structures, systems, and policies. The purple cells are on the outside because these tend to be the last things to change when we shift to a personalized learning model. The reason these things are the last to change is because they're systemic. We know working in JCPS that we often operate as a district like a whale, and schools are more like individual fish within a school of fish. And each fish within that school can pivot its direction a lot more easily and nimbly than the whale can change its direction. So while it's possible for the whale to change its direction, and we have, and we are, it takes time, and it takes the school of fish to begin to push that along. So some structures and systems that begin to shift once we shift to personalized learning is the flexibility of time and pace. Luckily, one of the things that the NTI experience has brought about is that it has really catalyzed these structures and systems to change. Right now, we're seeing a ton of flexibility in time and pace because it's simply the way that learning virtually has to be. We're also seeing a recognition of anytime, anywhere learning. One of my favorite stories is from this past spring. We had high school students competing in the Aspen Challenge, and we had high school students that were competing from the break room at Kroger. And so learning is no longer confined to the classroom in order for it to be recognized. We can now recognize, and we have to recognize, learning that happens anywhere, whether it means that learners are at home or at work or what have you. And then finally, learning spaces become flexible. In the classroom, this means that kids are no longer beholden to the, you know, singular kid in desks and rows of desks kind of idea. It means that classrooms are fluid spaces and flexible spaces. It means that kids have control over the environment that's best for their learning needs. And it's our job as teachers to help coach learners into making those decisions and reflecting on those decisions to see how they work better. I was in a classroom, I think 2 years ago at Rangeland Elementary, where when the learners walked into the room every morning, they chose their seat, they chose their place in the classroom, whether it was under a table or at a desk or on a couch, where they were going to learn for that day. But the important part of what I saw was that that teacher told every learner when they made their decision, and I believe this was like second grade, to be ready to defend their decision during morning meeting. And so it's not just about giving kids, you know, empty choices for the purpose of giving them choices, but helping them reflect on how those choices impacted their learning. And so that day she asked almost every learner, you know, what choice did you make today for your seat? What will that mean for your learning? Some learners she had to, you know, kind of remind, you know, yesterday you made that choice and it wasn't great. Let's make a different choice today. And so pairing learner choice with flexible learning spaces helps learners have agency over something that, you know, can seem pretty minuscule, but at that age helps us build a learner's capacity to engage within that decision-making process. And again, I would just remind you there are other structure and system shifts that happen in this outer ring if you were to click on this cell and go to the website and engage them with them. All right, so what are some ways to get started? Well, one option, and we see this all the time, is for you to choose a part of your workshop and begin to personalize just that part. And so when we think about our workshop, we essentially have 3 parts: our mini lesson where learners access new information, work time where learners engage with or practice that information, and then the reflection phase where they demonstrate it, often through an exit slip or maybe a reflective discussion. And so we often see teachers choose one of these pieces and personalize just that. So we might see a teacher offer 3 choices to a learner during the mini lesson of how to access new information. They might say, you can meet me on the carpet for a mini lesson. You can attempt this task independently, or you can watch this video on demand on how to attempt this new skill or learn this new standard. And that learner has the choice. Learners might engage with it the same way and they might demonstrate the same way. But the important part is the teacher has started to personalize and offer choices. And we just need to make sure that we reflect on those choices and what they mean for us as learners at the end of that lesson and throughout the process, honestly. And so that's a way that we see teachers begin to personalize learning as well. Another option is to choose a few, but not too many at once. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. A few cells from that honeycomb. And so again, I said that sometimes teachers will say, I'm really going to focus on the learner profile for, this amount of time. We do have some examples of learner profiles. If you wanted to follow up with me, my email is on the last slide, and we have tons of JCPS examples that come from elementary, middle, and high school, even learner profiles for our kindergartners. But we also have teachers that shift to standards-based grading and proficiency-based progress. We've had teachers choose the customization of pathways. That previous example that I offered just a second ago would be classified as a personalization of pathway. So maybe rather than choosing a part of your workshop, you look at the honeycomb and you choose 1 or 2 components to really focus on and start to shift your learning designs based on those components. A third option might be to try a unit design that lends itself to personalized learning. A structure like project-based learning, student-led conferences, or a passion project. All of these are inherently personalized because they leverage student voice, they leverage timely actionable feedback, they leverage agency, and they leverage choice over pathway. And so trying a structure like one of these things is one way to jump into personalized learning. And again, we've got lots of experts on the Deeper Learning team that can help co-design any one of these experiences. And you're welcome to reach out to us. We'd love to help you. We have a short reflection or exit slip here, just briefly. Recording sessions like this is something that's new for those of us that are providers of professional learning. And I would be very interested in any feedback that you guys can provide on how I can improve this experience. I think I probably have a lot to learn from YouTubers who are posting engaging videos that millions of people find interesting and spend their time watching. So please offer me some constructive feedback here. There's also a short exit slip embedded into this link as well. If this is something that you wanted to explore on your own, I've included some resources here. Here's some literature and research related to personalized learning. The framework we looked at today from the Institute for Personalized Learning, or as we like to call I4PL, because we cannot get enough acronyms in education. They have some specific distance learning resources that are really great for our current context. When we talk about shifting to personalizing demonstrations of learning, we have some great resources on performance assessments, how learners can demonstrate in a more meaningful way via a performance. We've got some articles on advising, kind of a model around coaching kids, which is a great structure to build agency and ownership, creating a classroom community virtually, and then some virtual back to school ideas. So these are some great resources to check out in your free time as well. And that is the end of Intro to Personalized Learning Part 1. I'm Maddie Shepard. My name is clickable, and this will take you to directly to my email. And this is my Twitter handle. The team and I often share great stories, celebrations, but more importantly, resources via Twitter. We know JCPS loves the Twitter. But like I said, you're more than welcome to email any one of us. We're happy to co-design, co-develop, co-dream, or just brainstorm your jump into personalized learning. So thank you very much for your time. Hope you enjoy the rest of your professional learning, and I'm here to help, so don't be afraid to reach out.